September 19, 1863. Dawn breaks over the rolling hills of northern Georgia. Near a creek called Chickamauga, a Cherokee, word meaning river of death. The morning air hangs thick with moisture and gunpowder. Private Jacob Miller, a 23-year-old farmhand from Logansport, Indiana, stands among the ranks of Company K, 9th Indiana Infantry, near a clearing known as Brock Field. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes the sound first distant, then thunderous of 50,000 Confederate soldiers moving into position. Miller has been in the field since 1861, having marched through Greenbrier, Corinth, Prairieville, and Stones River. But this day will be different. This day will fracture time itself, splitting his life into two unequal halves, the man he was before noon and the legend he would become after. The Battle of Chickamauga was no ordinary engagement. It was the second bloodiest confrontation of the American Civil War, exceeded in carnage only by Gettysburg. Over the course of 3 days, Union forces under Major General William Rosecrans clashed with Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee in a desperate struggle for control of Chattanooga, the vital rail hub that represented the gateway to the Deep South. By the morning of September 19th, more than 120,000 men were arrayed across a narrow stretch of woodland and open field, the Union center holding a fragile line between the Confederates and the city they sought to reclaim. The stakes were existential. For the Union, Chattanooga meant the severing of Confederate supply lines and a pathway into Georgia. For the South, it meant survival. The trees themselves seemed to anticipate what was coming. And then, at 7:30, the first shots rang out. Miller's division advanced shortly after noon, pushing into the chaos near Brock Field as Union and Confederate forces collided in the thick underbrush and rolling smoke. The noise was deafening, the crack of rifle fire, the screams of men, the thunder of artillery tearing through the forest canopy. It was here, in the midst of this maelstrom, that a Confederate musket ball found Jacob Miller. The bullet struck him directly between the eyes, with such force that it shattered the bone of his forehead, displacing his left eye from its socket, and penetrated deep into his brain. He fell backward into the dirt. His captain, looking down at the motionless body, spoke the words that should have been Miller's epitaph. "It's no use to remove poor Miller, for he is dead." And so they left him there, another casualty on a field that would claim nearly 35,000 men before the fighting ceased. But Jacob Miller was not dead. How long he lay unconscious among the fallen is unknown. Minutes, perhaps hours. When awareness returned, it came slowly, like surfacing from deep water. He opened his remaining eye to find himself behind Confederate lines. The realization was immediate and terrifying. If captured, he would be sent to a southern prison camp where disease and starvation killed more men than bullets ever did. Miller made a decision that defied every rational impulse. He would walk out. He struggled to his feet, using his rifle as a crutch, his face a mask of blood so thick that Confederate soldiers who passed him on the road did not recognize him as a Union soldier. Even his own major, who had been his captain before promotion, failed to identify him when they crossed paths. Miller's left eye dangled from its socket. With trembling hands, he pushed the crushed bone fragments of his forehead back together as best he could, then repositioned the eye and tied his bandana around his head to hold everything in place. Both eyes swelled shut. Blind, he began to walk. The journey that followed was an ordeal that bordered on the mythic. Miller could see only by forcing open the lid of his right eye with his fingers, catching brief glimpses of the road ahead before stumbling forward into darkness. He navigated by instinct and desperation, moving parallel to the Confederate line until he found a gap, then turning north toward Union-held Chattanooga, 15 miles away. At one point, he veered off the road and struck his head against a low-hanging tree limb, the impact sending him crashing to the ground. He rose again. He kept moving. Hours passed. His legs gave out, and he collapsed by the roadside. Ambulance drivers rattled past, calling down to ask if he was still alive, then moving on without stopping. Finally, one driver, a man whose name history did not record, saw Miller and offered him a place in his wagon, explaining that one of the wounded had died and been removed. Miller climbed in. He remembers nothing after that dot. What Miller expected was death. What he found instead was a second life, one measured not in years of peace, but in decades of endurance. He regained consciousness on Monday, September 21st, lying on the floor of a makeshift hospital in Chattanooga, surrounded by hundreds of other wounded men packed together, as thick as hogs in a stock car. Some talked quietly. Others groaned. Miller sat up, wet his bandana with water from his canteen, and pressed it to his wound. Two soldiers from his own company spotted him and approached in disbelief. They had seen his name printed in the newspapers among the dead. The Union Army, having been routed on September 20th when a gap opened in their lines, was in full retreat. Wounded men who could walk were ordered to cross the Tennessee River on a pontoon bridge to reach safety on the northern bank. Miller, still barely able to see, was led by comrades through the crush of retreating wagons, troops, and artillery. They did not reach the other side until sundown. That night, Miller and his companions found their company teamster, who gave them their first food since before dawn on September 19th, more than 2 full days without sustenance. The teamster stayed awake through the night, fetching cool water from a nearby spring to keep Miller's wound moist. The next morning, September 22nd, Miller reported to a field surgeon, who washed and dressed the wound for the first time. Then came the longest walk of all, 60 miles over Raccoon Mountain to Bridgeport, Alabama, where a train waited to carry the wounded north to Nashville. Miller began the journey in a wagon, but the jolting motion caused such agony in his fractured skull that he climbed out and walked the entire distance on foot, arriving 4 days later at the railhead. He boarded a boxcar and lay down. By the time the train reached Nashville, he had slipped into unconsciousness again. He awoke in a bathtub of warm water, being washed by hospital staff. He did not know the date. For 9 months, Miller moved through a succession of hospitals, Nashville, Louisville, New Albany, begging every surgeon he encountered to remove the bullet lodged in his brain. Each one refused, certain that the operation would kill him. The musket ball remained embedded in his skull, a foreign object pressing against delicate tissue, causing fits of delirium and stupor that could last for weeks. At times, when he caught a cold, the swelling in his brain would intensify, plunging him into unconsciousness. At other times, he would imagine himself back on picket duty, pacing back and forth with a stick on his shoulder, a ghost replaying the war in his mind. Finally, granted a furlough, Miller returned home to Logansport. There, 2 local doctors, Graham Fitch and Henry Coleman, agreed to attempt what military surgeons would not. They operated and successfully removed approximately 1/3 of the musket ball. The rest remained inside him, and piece by piece, over the course of decades, it continued to emerge. 17 years after the battle, a buckshot dropped from the wound. 31 years later, 2 more fragments of lead surfaced. His forehead never healed, leaving a deep, visible indentation where the bullet had entered, through which observers could see the pulsations of his brain. The wound became Miller's constant companion, a physical reminder that defined the remainder of his existence. He could not work, subsisting on a government pension of $40 per month. He married and had a son, but his memory faltered, and he often could not recall names. Yet the events of September 19, 1863, remained vivid, carved into his mind with perfect clarity. Some might ask how it is I can describe so minutely my getting wounded and getting off the battlefield after so many years. Miller wrote in a personal account for his family, My answer is I have an everyday reminder of it in my wound and constant pain in the head, never free of it while not asleep. The whole scene is imprinted on my brain as with a steel engraving. He suffered that pain every waking moment for 54 years. The bullet had not killed him, but it had transformed him into something else, a living monument to suffering, a man whose body bore witness to what war demanded and what the human spirit could endure. By the time Miller reached old age, he had become a legend among Civil War veterans. He attended reunions of the Grand Army of the Republic, where he was introduced as one of the most remarkable hero survivors of the Civil War. Newspapers wrote about him, calling him the most remarkable survivor, and marveling at the visible scar that marked him as someone who had crossed a threshold between life and death and somehow returned. Fellow veterans nicknamed him Center Shot, a grim acknowledgement of the precision with which fate had struck him and the improbability of his survival. At the age of 78, he was still traveling to encampments, still telling his story to those who would listen. Though he rarely spoke of it willingly, the memories were too immediate, too painful, too close to the surface. He lived until January 13, 1917, reaching the age of 76 by some accounts and 88 by others, his death coming more than half a century after the day he was supposed to have died on a G battlefield in Georgia, the Battle of Chickamauga. Itself ended in a Confederate victory. General Bragg's forces broke through Union lines on September 20th, driving Rosecrans and much of his army back into Chattanooga, where they were besieged for over a month before being relieved by reinforcements under Ulysses S. Grant. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The Confederate Army lost more than 18,000 men, 20% of its total force, in a battle that produced no lasting strategic gain. The Union Army, despite its retreat, held Chattanooga and would launch its invasion of Georgia the following year. For the soldiers who fought there, Chickamauga became synonymous with slaughter, a place where the trees ran red and a creek lived up to its name. Of the tens of thousands who fell, most were carried from the field on stretchers or left where they died, their stories lost to time. Jacob Miller walked away on his own feet, blind and bleeding, with a bullet in his brain and a hole in his forehead that would never close. Miller's survival defies medical explanation, even by modern standards. The human brain is extraordinarily fragile, protected by the skull, but vulnerable to trauma, infection, and swelling. A musket ball entering the frontal lobe, the region responsible for decision-making, personality, and motor control, should have caused immediate death or irreversible damage. The fact that Miller remained conscious long enough to reposition his own eye and navigate miles of hostile terrain suggests that the bullet, by some accident of trajectory, missed the most critical structures. The fact that he survived the subsequent journey, 4 days of walking with an open head wound in an era before antibiotics, when battlefield infections routinely killed soldiers who survived their initial injuries, borders on the miraculous. The surgeons who examined him believed he would die if they attempted to remove the bullet, yet he lived for decades with it lodged in his skull. The fragments that continued to surface over the years were physical evidence of the body's slow, persistent effort to expel what did not belong, a process that spanned more than 3 decades. But Miller's story is not merely one of biological resilience. It is a testament to the human capacity for endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. The 15 miles he walked from Chickamauga to Chattanooga, the 60 miles over Raccoon Mountain to Bridgeport, the 54 years he lived with constant pain, these are not the actions of a man driven by survival instinct alone. They are the actions of someone who chose again and again to keep moving forward when every rational calculation argued for surrender. Miller's determination not to become a prisoner, his refusal to lie by the roadside and wait for death, his insistence on walking when a wagon was available, these decisions, reveal a will that transcended the body's limitations. He was not a hero in the traditional sense, not a man who charged into enemy fire or led troops to victory. He was something quieter and perhaps more profound, a man who endured. The wound itself became a symbol. In an age before photography was widespread, physical scars served as proof of service, visible markers of sacrifice that commanded respect and recognition. Miller's forehead bore a hole deep enough to expose the brain beneath, an injury so dramatic that it made him instantly recognizable and impossible to forget. Veterans who met him saw in that scar a reflection of their own suffering, a reminder of the price they had all paid. Civilians who encountered him saw something else, evidence of the war's brutality, a living record of what it meant to send men into battle. The scar was a document, a text written in flesh that spoke more eloquently than words ever could. And because the wound never healed, because it remained open and visible for the rest of Miller's life, it served as a permanent reminder that the war did not end when the shooting stopped. For Jacob Miller, the war continued every day, in every waking moment, until his death in 1917. There is a poetic symmetry in the fact that the bullet fragments continued to emerge over the decades, surfacing at intervals as if the past refused to remain buried. 17 years after Chickamauga, a buckshot emerged, a small piece of lead that had lain dormant through the end of the war. The assassination of Lincoln, the collapse of Reconstruction, and the dawn of the Gilded Age. 31 years after the battle, 2 more pieces surfaced, arriving as the 19th century drew to a close and the nation that had torn itself apart began to stitch itself back together. Each fragment was a message from 1863, a physical link between the man Miller had become and the young soldier who had fallen in Brock Field. The body remembers what the mind cannot afford to forget. Miller lived through an America transformed. He enlisted in 1861, when the nation was a patchwork of farms and small towns connected by dirt roads and wooden bridges. He died in 1917 in a country of cities, factories, and railroads, on the eve of its entry into a world war that would make the conflicts of his youth seem almost quaint by comparison. He witnessed the abolition of slavery, the impeachment of a president, the closing of the frontier, the rise of industrialization, and the birth of modern America. Through it all, the hole in his forehead remained unchanging, a fixed point in a world that had moved on. He became a relic of a vanished era, a man whose body testified to a time when soldiers fought with muskets and bayonets, when medical science could do little more than dress wounds and hope for the best, when survival itself was a form of heroism in the end. Jacob Miller's legacy is not the battles he fought or the distance he walked, though both are remarkable. It is the simple, stubborn fact that he lived. He lived when he should have died, lived through pain that would have broken lesser men, lived long enough to see his name removed from the casualty lists and restored to the living. He lived to tell his story, to write it down in his own hand, so that his family would know what had happened to him on that September morning in Georgia. He lived to become a symbol not of war's glory, but of its cost, not of victory, but of survival. The hole between his eyes was a window into the abyss that war opens beneath the feet of those who fight it. And the fact that Jacob Miller stood at the edge of that abyss and did not fall is a testament to something profound and enduring in the human spirit. He was not immortal. The bullet did not miss. But he refused to die, and in that refusal lies a truth more powerful than any monument or memorial, that the will to live, to endure, to keep moving forward even when every step brings pain, is one of the most extraordinary forces in the human experience. Jacob Miller carried that truth in his body for 54 years, a walking reminder that even the worst wounds do not have to be fatal. That survival is possible even in the face of impossible odds. And that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to wake up each morning and face another day.